Have you ever encountered a soul so weary, yet so dignified, that it forced you to reevaluate your entire existence? Julian was standing in the quiet aisle of an old hardware store in the outskirts of Chicago when a young woman, clutching a heavy winter coat and a shivering toddler, spoke a sentence that would echo through the chambers of his heart forever. I promise to settle the rest when the frost breaks. In what followed that freezing January afternoon didn't just alter the course of her life. It dismantled the walls of a lonely man's empire. If you believe that a single act of empathy can ripple across a lifetime, stay with us until the very end to witness this breathtaking transformation. Julian walked through the dusty aisles with a heavy nostalgia that seemed to settle in his bones every time he returned to this neighborhood. This specific shop, tucked away in a weathered corner of the city, was the same place his father had brought him 30 years ago, teaching him the weight of a hammer and the value of a man's word. Now, at 41 years old, Julian returned here not because he needed tools. He owned a construction conglomerate that managed skyscrapers, but because he needed to feel the grit of the world he had come from. The winter sun was pale and weak, casting long, skeletal shadows across the floor. Julian held nothing but a small box of brass screws, a modest purchase for a man who lived in a glass penthouse where the only sound was the hum of the air purifier. But that day, as he approached the weathered wooden counter, the sterile silence of his life was about to be shattered. Standing before him was a woman, perhaps in her late 20s, balancing a small boy on her hip while her other hand fumbled through a worn leather wallet, pulling out crumpled singles and a handful of copper coins. Julian watched her fingers, reddened by the cold and trembling slightly, as she counted the change for a small space heater and a roll of weather stripping. The clerk, an older man with greying hair, waited with a look of tired pity, while a few customers behind Julian began to huff and shift their weight, their breath visible in the unheated air. The boy, who couldn't have been more than 4, stared at the colourful candy bars by the register with wide, hollow eyes, but he remained silent, his small hand gripping his mother's collar. He didn't ask for a treat. He had already learned the silent language of, "We can't afford it." The woman looked up, her voice steady despite the visible tremor in her shoulders. "How much more do I need?" she asked, her pride acting as a shield against the cold. The clerk checked the screen and sighed softly. "It's another $12, Sarah." Her face tightened for a moment, a flicker of internal devastation passing behind her eyes. She slowly pushed a gallon of milk and a loaf of bread back toward the clerk. "I'll have to leave these then," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the heater's hum. Then she took a deep breath, looked the clerk in the eyes with a ferocity that pierced Julian's chest like a shard of ice, and said, "I promise to pay you the rest when I get my next shift. You know my word is good." It wasn't a plea for charity, it was a declaration of character. It was the promise of someone who had been beaten by the world, but refused to let it take her integrity. Julian felt a dormant part of his soul stir, a part that had been asleep since his world turned cold years ago. Without a word, he stepped forward and laid a $100 bill on the counter. "I'll take care of the entire balance," he said, his voice low and calm. The woman spun around, her eyes widening in shock. "No, sir, I don't take handouts," she started, her cheeks flushing with a mix of shame and anger. Julian simply smiled, a genuine soft expression that didn't reach for gratitude. "It's already done," he replied. "Consider it a neighborly gesture, from one human to another." The woman stood frozen for a long beat, her arms tightening around little Leo, who watched Julian with silent curiosity. "I don't know how I'll ever repay you," she managed to say, her voice cracking under the weight of the kindness. Julian simply shook his head. "You don't need to. Just make sure that boy stays warm tonight," he said, nodding toward the child who was now offering a shy, toothy grin. They exited the store together, the biting Chicago wind whipping at their coats. Julian assumed this was the end, a fleeting moment of charity destined to be forgotten in the blur of the city. But destiny is a persistent architect. In the slush-covered parking lot, as Julian reached for the handle of his black SUV, he heard a frantic call behind him. "Sir, please wait!" It was her, struggling through the snow with the heater box in one hand and her son in the other. Julian stopped and turned. She reached him breathless, her hair disheveled, and her eyes brimming with tears she refused to let fall. "I'm sorry to bother you again," she panted, "but I realized I don't have enough for the bus, and the heater is too heavy to carry 6 blocks in this wind." She looked down at her boots, which were salt-stained and leaking. Julian saw more than a woman in trouble. He saw a fighter who had finally reached the edge of her strength. "Get in. I'll drive you," Julian said, opening the door to the plush, heated interior of his vehicle. She hesitated, calculating the risk of trusting a stranger, but the sight of Leo's blue-tinged lips made the decision for her. She climbed in, settling the boy into the leather seat and placing the bags at her feet. Julian started the engine. The warmth of the car immediately enveloped them. "Where to?" he asked. "The apartments on 4th Street, near the old mill," she murmured, her gaze fixed on the window as if embarrassed to be seen in such a modest neighborhood. He nodded and pulled out into the grey afternoon. The silence in the car was heavy, broken only by the soft click of the turn signal and the occasional sneeze from the back seat. Julian watched her in the rearview mirror. She was staring at the passing city with a 1,000-yard stare. He was the one who eventually broke the quiet. "What's the little guy's name?" he asked. She looked up, surprised by the personal interest. "Leo," she said, a small smile finally touching her lips as she stroked the boy's hair. "He just turned 4 last month." Julian smiled back. "He's a brave kid, didn't complain once in that cold store." She nodded, a flash of maternal pride in her eyes. "He's good. Sometimes he's too good for his own sake. He knows more than a 4-year-old should." The weight behind her words hung in the air. Julian felt a pang of something sharp in his gut. "Do you have any children of your own?" she asked tentatively. The question hit Julian like a physical blow, a ghost from his past suddenly standing in the middle of the road. "No," he replied shortly, his tone clipping the conversation. She sensed the pain in his voice and didn't push further. As they wound through the narrow, potholed streets of the industrial district, the grand architecture of the city centre gave way to rusted fences and boarded-up windows. Julian noticed her becoming increasingly restless, her hands wringing her scarf. "Are you okay?" he asked softly. She exhaled a long, shaky breath. "I just don't want you to think I'm irresponsible," she began. "The money I had today was supposed to last the week. I worked 2 jobs, waitressing at the diner and cleaning offices at night. But Leo woke up with a terrifying cough 3 days ago. The clinic visit and the inhaler took almost every cent I had saved for the heating bill." Tears finally escaped, tracing hot paths down her cold cheeks. Julian felt his chest tighten. He had spent his life accumulating wealth to avoid exactly this kind of choice, the choice between a child's health and a warm room. "And his father?" Julian asked, though he feared the answer. She let out a hollow, bitter laugh. "He vanished the moment the test turned positive, said he wasn't built for the burden and told me to figure it out." She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, while Leo, sensing his mother's distress, reached out a small hand to pat her arm. "Don't cry, Mommy," he whispered. Those 3 words shattered whatever was left of Julian's emotional armor. They arrived at a crumbling brick building where the paint was peeling like dead skin. "It's here," she said. Before she got out, she looked at Julian with an intensity that demanded to be taken seriously. "Sir, can I have your phone number? Or a business card?" Julian was taken aback. "I promise, the moment I get my bonus from the cleaning company, I will pay you back every dime," she insisted. He reached into his pocket and handed her a card, not because he wanted the money, but because he saw that she needed to believe she would pay him back. "My name is Sarah," she said, clutching the card like a holy relic, "and I always keep my promises." As Julian drove away, watching the heavy steel door of the apartment building close behind her, he knew that Sarah had left a permanent mark on his soul. He returned to his sprawling penthouse as the Chicago skyline lit up in 1,000 cold lights. His home was a masterpiece of modern design, marble floors, floor-to-ceiling glass, and absolute, crushing silence. He made a drink he didn't want and sat in a designer chair that felt like a throne in a tomb. He couldn't stop thinking about the way Leo had comforted his mother. Why did this woman affect him so deeply? Julian had donated millions to charities. He had seen his name on the plaques of hospital wings. But those were transactions. This was a confrontation with a reality he had spent years trying to forget. He stood by the window and remembered the sound of Leo's voice. "Don't cry, Mommy." He closed his eyes, and the ghosts he had buried 7 years ago began to claw their way back to the surface. 7 years ago, Julian had been married to Elena, a brilliant architect with a laugh that could brighten the darkest room. They were the power couple of the city. Their marriage was a whirlwind of galas, travel, and grand plans. But after 3 years, Elena began to talk about a nursery. Julian wanted it too. He imagined a son to teach the business to, a daughter to walk through the parks with. But the months turned into a year, and the nursery remained a guest room. They went to a specialist, expecting a simple fix. The afternoon the results came in was etched into Julian's memory in high definition. The doctor's office was too bright, smelling of antiseptic and bad news. The doctor looked at the charts and spoke the words that ended Julian's world. "Julian, the tests show a complete absence of viable sperm. It's a permanent condition. You are biologically unable to father children." The silence that followed was deafening. He looked at Elena, expecting a hand to hold, a word of, "It doesn't matter." But what he saw in her eyes was a sudden, chilling distance. There was disappointment there, a resentment that grew like a cancer over the following months. Elena drifted away. She stopped laughing. She stopped looking at him. She eventually confessed, "I can't live a life without a child of my own blood, Julian. I need that experience." She left 3 weeks later, leaving behind a cold house and a man who felt like a broken machine. He had closed his heart then, convinced that no woman could truly love a man who couldn't provide a legacy. Until Sarah and Leo showed him that family isn't about DNA, it's about who shows up when the world is freezing. The weeks passed in a blur of board meetings and blueprints. Julian found himself distracted. He would be in the middle of a multi-million-dollar negotiation and suddenly see Sarah's trembling hands counting copper coins. He kept her card in his wallet, taking it out in the quiet moments to remind himself she was real. His business partners noticed. "You're miles away, Julian," his friend Marcus noted over lunch. Julian just shrugged. How could he explain that a woman he'd known for 20 minutes had hijacked his inner world? It was a rainy Tuesday when his phone buzzed with an unrecognized number. Julian was in his office, overlooking the grey lake, when he answered. "Hello?" A woman's voice, nervous but clear, came through the line. "Mr. Julian, it's Sarah, from the hardware store." Julian's heart did a strange, rhythmic skip. He sat up straight, clearing his desk of papers. "Sarah, of course. How are you? How is Leo?" "We're doing well. Leo's cough is gone," she said, and Julian felt a genuine wave of relief. "I'm calling because I have the money. I've saved enough to pay you back for the heater and the groceries." Julian closed his eyes. "Sarah, please." "It really isn't necessary," he began, but she cut him off with a gentle firmness. "To me, it is. My mother taught me that a debt is a weight on the soul. I want to meet you and give it back." Julian realized that to refuse would be to insult her dignity. "All right," he agreed. "Where would you like to meet?" She suggested a small, greasy spoon cafe near the old industrial docks. "It's not fancy," she apologized, "but they have the best coffee in the neighborhood." Julian arrived 15 minutes early. The cafe was a relic of a different era. Checkerboard floors, vinyl booths, and the smell of bacon grease and old dreams. Julian felt more alive in that booth than he had in years of fine dining. When Sarah walked in, wearing a simple wool coat and a determined expression, their eyes met, and a spark of recognition, something deeper than a casual acquaintance, passed between them. She sat down and immediately pushed a plain white envelope across the table. "It's all there," she said. Julian took it, not because he wanted the cash, but because he wanted her to feel the triumph of her own word. He tucked it into his jacket without looking inside. "I knew you were a woman of your word," he said. They spent the next hour talking. She told him about her dream of becoming a nurse, about her struggle to find stable childcare, about her son's obsession with airplanes. Julian listened, mesmerized by the beauty in her struggle. He realized then that this wasn't just a meeting to settle a debt. This was the opening of a door he thought had been locked forever. As they sat in that booth, sharing a plate of cheap muffins, a new chapter began to write itself. Before we continue this incredible journey, if Sarah's strength and Julian's kindness are touching your heart, please consider becoming a part of our community. We share these stories to remind ourselves that the world is still full of light. Subscribe and tell us in the comments. Do you believe in fate, or do we create our own miracles? A few days later, Julian found a reason to see them again. He invited Sarah and Leo to the city's large botanical garden on a Sunday. Leo mentioned he likes plants, Julian wrote in a text, his hands shaking as he hit send. Sarah took an hour to reply. Leo would love that, thank you. That Sunday was crisp and clear. Julian picked them up, and the boys' excitement was infectious. We're going to the big glass house, Leo cheered from the back. The gardens were a sanctuary of green in a city of grey. They walked through the tropical conservatory, Leo staring at the massive palm leaves with awe. Julian bought them ice cream, and they sat by a koi pond. He watched Sarah interact with her son, the way she knelt in the dirt to explain how the fish breathed, the way she laughed when Leo tried to mimic a parrot. There was a richness in her poverty that Julian's wealth could never replicate. We should do this more often, Julian suggested, his heart pounding. Sarah looked at him with those deep, searching eyes. I don't want to take advantage of your kindness, Julian, she said, using his name for the first time without a title. He smiled. It's not kindness, Sarah. It's me having a good time. I've been very lonely for a long time. Her hand, resting on the wooden bench, brushed against his. They didn't pull away. Sundays became a tradition. They went to the zoo, the science museum, and the planetarium. But it wasn't just the big outings. Julian began showing up at the diner where Sarah worked, sitting in her section just to see her smile. He brought Leo new books and a small model airplane. He was careful never to mention his true net worth, afraid that the millions in his bank account would create a wall between them. He wanted her to love Julian the man, not Julian the bank. In one evening, as they walked through a neighborhood festival, Leo grew tired. Can you carry me? My legs are sleepy, he asked Julian with the absolute confidence of a child who feels safe. Julian lifted him without hesitation, feeling the warm, small weight against his chest. Leo tucked his head into Julian's shoulder and sighed. You smell like wood and sweaters, the boy murmured, before drifting off. Sarah watched them, her eyes shimmering. He never knew his grandfather, she whispered. My father died before he was born. He's never had a man to look up to like this. Julian felt a profound shift inside him. For years he believed he was a dead end, a man with no future. But with Leo asleep in his arms, he realized that fate hadn't taken away his fatherhood. It had simply redirected it. The peace was shattered at 3 a.m. on a Tuesday. Julian's phone screamed into the darkness of his bedroom. He grabbed it, seeing Sarah's name, and fear flooded his veins. Sarah? What's wrong? He heard ragged sobbing on the other end. Julian, it's Leo. He can't catch his breath. His fever is so high, I don't know what to do. Julian was out of bed before she finished the sentence. Stay where you are. I'm coming. Now. He drove through the deserted streets like a man possessed. He reached her apartment in 12 minutes. Sarah opened the door, clutching a pale, sweating Leo wrapped in a thin blanket. The boy's breathing was a terrifying, wet rattle. Get in the car, Julian ordered. He drove toward the city's best pediatric hospital, his hand reaching back to touch Sarah's shoulder as she wept in the back seat. Hang on, Leo, Julian whispered. Just hang on, buddy. At the ER, Julian didn't wait. He carried Leo inside, shouting for help. Nurses swarmed them immediately. They took Leo behind the double doors, leaving Julian and Sarah in a sterile white waiting room. Sarah collapsed into a plastic chair, her face buried in her hands. Julian sat beside her, pulling her into his arms. He's going to be okay. He has to be, he murmured, though his own heart was failing him. An hour later, a doctor appeared. He has severe pneumonia, he explained. We've started him on IV antibiotics and oxygen. You brought him just in time. Another hour, and his lungs might have collapsed. Sarah let out a sob of pure agony and relief. Julian held her tighter, feeling the tremors rack her body. They spent the next 3 days in that hospital room. Julian cancelled every meeting, every contract. "Family emergency," he told his office, and he meant it. He stayed by the bedside, watching Leo's chest rise and fall with the help of the machines. He brought Sarah food she couldn't eat and coffee she didn't drink. On the 3rd night, when Leo's fever finally broke, the boy opened his eyes and saw Julian. "Are you still here?" he whispered hoarsely. Julian took the boy's small hand. "I'm not going anywhere, Leo. I promise." When the day of discharge finally came, Sarah's joy was clouded by a dark shadow. She held the thick envelope of hospital paperwork, her hand shaking. Julian knew exactly what she was thinking. "The bill," she whispered. 4 days of intensive care. I'll be in debt for the rest of my life." Julian took the papers from her hand. "Trust me," he said. He went down to the billing office. The total was over $18,000. Julian paid it in full with a single swipe of his card. When the clerk asked whose name to put on the receipt, Julian thought of Sarah's pride. "Put it in Sarah's name," he said. "Mark it, paid in full by anonymous grant." When he returned to the room, he handed her the receipt. She saw the red stamp and looked at Julian, her eyes filling with a debt she knew she could never pay with money. "I will pay you back," she vowed again, her voice thick with emotion. Julian took her hands. "Sarah, you already have. You gave me a reason to be a man again. You gave me a family." He dropped to one knee right there in the hospital room, amidst the hum of monitors and the smell of antiseptic. "I don't have a ring yet, and I know this is crazy, but I don't want to spend another night in a house that doesn't have your laughter in it. Sarah, will you marry me? Will you let me be Leo's father?" Sarah fell to her knees in front of him, sobbing yes into his neck. Leo, sitting up in bed, cheered weakly. "Does this mean Julian stays for lunch every day?" Julian laughed through his tears. "Every day, Leo, for the rest of our lives." The transition was a whirlwind. Julian helped them move out of the crumbling apartment into his home. He watched with a full heart as Leo ran through the sprawling hallways, his laughter finally filling the silence. He turned one of the many guest rooms into a bedroom fit for a prince, filled with model airplanes and the world's largest stuffed dinosaur. He watched Sarah trade her waitress uniform for nursing school scrubs, supporting her every step of the way. They married in a small garden ceremony 3 months later. There were no cameras, no socialites, just the 3 of them and the promise they had made to each other. Julian finally understood that his life hadn't been empty because he lacked a biological child. It had been empty because he lacked a purpose. 3 years have passed since that day in the hardware store. It is a warm Sunday in Chicago. Julian is pushing a swing in a local park. A 2-year-old girl named Maya, whom they adopted a year ago, is squealing with delight. Nearby, a 7-year-old Leo is playing catch with a group of friends, his health robust and his smile bright. Sarah sits on a nearby bench, watching her family with a look of profound peace. Julian walks over and sits beside her, taking her hand. "Do you remember the store?" he asks. Sarah smiles, leaning her head on his shoulder. "I remember a man who saw me when everyone else looked away." Julian kisses her forehead. "And I remember a woman who promised to pay me back. You did, Sarah. Every single day you pay me back with a love I didn't think I deserved. Thank you for walking this path with us." This story is a testament to the fact that our greatest trials often lead us to our greatest treasures. If Julian and Sarah's story reminded you that it's never too late for a second chance, please subscribe to our channel. We are a community built on hope and empathy. Share your own stories of unexpected kindness in the comments below. Have you ever had a hardware store moment that changed everything? We read every single word you write. Until next time, remember, a simple promise can build a kingdom of love. God bless.